Muy buenas tardes a todos. Les damos
Good
la
afternoon,
bienvenida.
ladies and gentlemen. We would like to welcome you to this session of our work group, the SILA work group. Before I introduce our speakers, we will listen to a few words by our chairwoman, Sandra Ramirez. Good afternoon. Welcome. I would like to thank you all for the opportunity, and I would like to pay homage to our friend, Dr. Desiderio Sanabria, who passed away a few days ago, and we will always remember him as an example of passion and commitment. And as an old Scottish poem says, you can smile, open your eyes, and continue on your way. We are going to miss him dearly, but we are going to do what he would have liked, which is to talk about insurance law. Alonso Nuñez del Prado, Roberto Rios from Chile. Thank you very much. This is the team that has prepared this session. I would like to acknowledge our friend and teacher, Abel Veiga, who is joining us from Spain, or wherever you are, we don't know, but he is from Spain. And well, these are the advantages of the pandemic. It is allowing us to be close in spite of the distance. This is the result of the combined efforts of all of you. So thank you very much, and I wish you every kind of success during this meeting. Thank you. Thank you, Sandra, for your kind words. This evening, we will have the participation of two speakers. The first one, as Sandra mentioned, is Professor Abel Veiga Copo. He is a professor at the Comillas University in Spain. He has many publications regarding trade law and insurance law, so it's a pleasure to have him here with us. Thank you very much for accepting our invitation. Professor Alonso Nuñez del Prado is a chair at the Pontifical Catholic University of Peru. He is currently a member of the AIDA Council. We are going to discuss two issues. Alonso Nuñez del Prado will talk about the principle of reasonableness and the expectation of policy holders. Alonso Nuñez del Prado, you have the floor. Thank you very much, Roberto. Good afternoon, good evening, to those of you in a different time zone. The idea of my presentation is to develop this idea of the principle of reasonableness and the expectations of the policy holders. But before that, I would like to share my screen with you and show the agenda for my presentation, the order of my presentation. I will make an introduction that I believe is very important. I will talk about supervision, insurance law as a concept, and then I will move on to the insurers and a proposal of a new way to see them. Right after that, I will talk about the principle of insurance law, the principles of insurance law that I have organized in such a way that we can visualize clearly where is reasonableness and the doctrine of reasonable expectations, which I am going to discuss today. After mentioning the principles, I will talk about the principle of reasonable expectation. This presentation is going to be very brief, so I don't think that we will have problems. The idea is to start with the topic of discussing what is the insurance system about. It is really a reciprocity. It is a group of people that contribute to a common fund so that this can pay for claims. This is organized in branches. There is a common fund for automobiles, for example. There is another common fund for theft, etc., etc. So the system, understood in its simplest way, is a common fund. That is a reciprocity. What we understand as reciprocity, what we understand as a group of people that cooperate and contribute according to their own risk, to the amount they want to insure, etc., along with many other technical characteristics that establish the rate. This reciprocity system makes us ask ourselves a specific question, and that is, why is the insurance system supervised? In the Peruvian case, it is supervised by the Constitution. The supervision of the insurance system, and not only all the other systems, are supervised. The question is, why is this insurance system supervised? And the answer or answers of the doctrine vary. Many people simply answer that it's because it's important. But the real reason, the in-depth reason why the insurance system is supervised is because it manages money from the policy holders. The system manages the money from the public, the policyholders, that is, just like banks manage the money of their customers, the insurers manage the money from the policy holders. So now we have to ask ourselves another question. How do the insurers pay the claims? Claims are paid by the insurers using this fund, this accumulated fund, which is the result of the contribution of the policy holders. Now, we understand better that what we have is a mutual system that is under supervision. In the Peruvian case, the superintendency of banks and insurers is the one that does this supervision. The fundament of this supervision, or the reason for this supervision, is because the money belongs to the policy holders. Now, another important issue is the way in which the insurers are organized. In the Anglo-Saxon system and in the US, which is the market that I know best, the system gave a lot of importance to mutual insurers. So things are much more transparent. Since there are mutual insurers, policyholders or the public can see more clearly, more transparently what I have just explained. That is, that the money used to pay the claims is money from the common funds that they contribute to. So there is a public interest. And as a consequence, all the regulation results from this public interest, from the need to supervise, to control, to oversee from the state how the system works, how insurers have to invest, what are the limitations for contracts. That's why we have the insurance contract law. Brokers are regulated as well. So in summary, we have a scene that tells us that insurance law, against everything that has been said before, has a public law ingredient, a very important ingredient. Insurance law was seen as a branch of trade law, but I think that this is not so. There is a very important public law ingredient that we have to keep in mind. And having clarified the issue of reciprocity, maybe it's worth mentioning that in the year 2015, there was a publication in the US called Other People's Money, which was translated into Spanish as well. And if you look for this publication in Amazon, for example, you can see the version in Spanish, and it showed what I have just said. The money managed by the insurers and by the financial system is the public's. It's the public's money. This book was commented on the main newspaper here in Peru, El Comercio, in 2016. The president of the Peruvian Association of Insurance Law commented on this book. And recently, after a legislation that was discussed in our Congress, the general manager of the Banco de Crédito of Peru also wrote an article where he stated that out of $10 that are lent in the financial system, 9 belong to the depositors. So how does this support what I have just said? It is very clear that the system needs supervision and it has a very important element of public law. The second issue I want to discuss is the social organization form. In Peru and in many of our countries, insurers are organized as limited companies. And these limited companies condition makes things a little bit blurry, because the feeling that most of the public has, and many insurance specialists also believe that the money belongs to the insurers. And in legal terms, yes, this is true. But as my grandmother used to say, no matter how much you try to disguise things, things are the same in the end. No matter how the insurer is organized legally, the truth is that the money that is used to pay the claims comes from the common fund. So in consequence, this money belongs to the
policy holders. This can be discussed in a legal plane, but not in a practical
plane, if you wish, but not during this presentation. What I would like to propose to you now is something that is proposed by Klaus Schwab, who founded the World Economic Forum. And he states that the companies, not just the insurance companies, should not report to their shareholders only, but their stakeholders. Society that includes suppliers, customers, community, government, ecosystem, etc. And this proposal by Klaus Schwab has been approved by the Business Roundtable, which is a association of general managers in the US. So this means that we should not consider this proposal as a communist proposal or a proposal by enemies of the system. It's a proposal by people that understand that companies have to have the aim of profit, not just profit, or but rather they have to work with a larger vision. And I will dare make a different proposal. This fund that I am talking about should be independent, as it has happened in the pension fund administrations agencies, whereby the pension fund agencies should not touch this money. They should just manage these funds. And it actually works in this way in part, but it would be important to separate it completely. The money of policy holders should be kept in separate funds from those managed by the insurance company, and the insurance company invests their money, and it has to obtain profit according to the quality and the quantity of their investments. There are many things or many ways in which they get paid. I have made long introduction. So I will talk about the principles of insurance law. As you know, there are different perceptions here. Our insurance contract law establishes five principles. The first one is the principle of indemnification, utmost good faith, reciprocity, insurable interest, and finally, the doctrine of proximate or adequate cause, as it is established under the law. There is a sixth element, which is interpretation of or interpretation against the draftsman, but it's not a principle. I consider that the principle of reasonableness and as a consequence the reasonable expectations of the policyholders, these are principles that are part of the principle of good faith. Carlos Ignacio Jaramillo not long ago published a book in which he discusses the issue of reasonableness. Carlos Ignacio Jaramillo is the chairman of AIDA, and in this book he talks about reasonableness from different points of view, but not from the point of view of insurance law. Reasonableness, I will very quickly on this topic. This is widely spread in different legislations and international agreements. Constitutional law and the rulings of the courts, many courts are based on the principle of reasonableness. We see the Vienna Convention on the purchase and sale of goods and services, and many other trade frameworks all include the topic of reasonableness. In insurance law, reasonableness is everywhere. The insurer has to be reasonable, the policyholder has to be reasonable, and the supervising authority has to be reasonable as well. I could talk a lot about this topic, but we don't have the time to do so. So I will just add to this part of my presentation is that reasonableness implies, as the word itself says, common sense, proportionality, justice, adequacy. In other words, reasonableness is something that is completely arbitrary. I will move on to the final part of my presentation, the expectations of the reasonable expectations of policy holders. This is a principle that is based on the reasonable expectations of the policy holders. According to these doctrines, courts award coverage to a policy holder as a guidelines for interpreting the insurance contract, even when it denies the coverage. In the US, there are different points of view about this doctrine, but the strongest ones ignore the clear text of the contract and they respect the expectations of the policy holders. In Spain, this has been commented by Ballesteros, and Ballesteros highlights that the most important part of this doctrine is the parole evidence, and it says that the signature in these contracts of addition is insufficient. This doctrine was presented by Robert Keaton, a professor of Harvard, and it has now widespread to all the system that uses contracts of addition. Finally, I would like to mention a very current topic. The policies are not contracts. These are products that are sold on the basis of take it or leave it. As a consequence, if the policy is not well done, the draftsman has to respond for this. Is this just applicable to the consumers only? I think it's not just applicable to all the consumers only, but also the policyholders, individuals or corporations that have not been able to do important changes on their policy. This means that this is valid for all policy holders. The intervention of a broker does not remove its quality of addition according to the legislation. Because the reality shows that the intervention of a broker does not achieve important changes in the previous drafting made by the insurance company. The truth, to conclude, I would like to say that every time we see that policies are not seen or analyzed as contracts, as an agreement of wills, because they are not an agreement of wills. If a company requires an insurance and they buy it, they take out a policy, they find out that all the alternatives in the market are very similar. An alternative that the insurance contract law proposed was to draft minimum conditions for the different insurance branches in such a way that the competition, free market had a bottom, and you could not offer less than this a bottom. It had a bottom and not a ceiling. So you could not include exclusions like we are seeing right now. We have a pandemic, and all renewals are include pandemic exclusion, but in the exclusions have been present in history forever. If we consider the exclusions that have been incorporated in our markets and international markets, it's huge. Every time the insurers do not want to cover something, they exclude it. And this is something that needs to be discussed widely. If we have a floor or a bottom, what would happen in these cases is that the insurance companies would have to justify to their supervisors the need to make this exclusion. That is all I have to say. Thank you very much. Thank you, Alonso, for your presentation. You can ask your questions on the chat board. Professor Veiga, you have the floor now. Thank you very much. Can you hear me?
Voy a intentar en la ponencia que tengo.
Well, my presentation is about an abstract plane, which are the functions of insurances. And, well, I will start by the concept of insurance. As Professor Sanchez Calero used to say, sometimes it is not good for a law to start talking about a concept or a contract, in this case, an insurance contract. We have to think about what are the foundations of the contracts. Beyond its functions, we have to ask ourselves, what is the foundation of the contract? Why are we taking out this contract? In Brazil, in a presentation I had a few minutes ago, I was saying that, is this a purchase contract? If I do not want to take on this risk, I give it to an insurance company to manage that. That is a purchase contract. I have repeated this in other presentations. The insurance contract is random, and it's a commutative contract as well. So it sort of breaks some of the schemes that we already know. What's the purpose of the insurance contract? Where is the good faith in the contract? All of this has to be based on balance. We have to recompose negotiation, take it or leave it, is what Alonso said a few minutes ago. So how do we rebuild this? Do we do this through the functions of the insurance contract, the legal function, guaranteeing risks in exchange for premiums? Do we guarantee the balance of the contract? But how do we know if all this can change? The pandemic is an example of this, how it has changed the risks or modified the risks. We also have, or we also should question if we should continue talking about the social function. When we talk about the social function from the distributive economic point of view, we talk about this without content, without considering the scope of what I have said. Nobody is interested on the social function of the contract because the companies, these companies are for-profit companies. They are giving these contracts in exchange for a price. So who has to be in charge of the social function? So what I want to say is we have to ask us why, the why of this reason for this contract. It's reasonableness, not just its legal reasonableness, but its sociologic and its psychological and economic reasonableness. In 1976, it was said the psychological role of contracts was mentioned. But, well, all of this is the basis or the foundation of the contract. Why do you buy risks in exchange for a price? Why should we apply this to insurance contracts? Where do we leave the function of guaranteeing, of assuming a damage in exchange for this premium? So we're talking about a sales contract. Aisling used to say this in the 70s already, and we get guarantees in exchange of a price. Should a risk happen or become a reality? So all of this are the basis of the contracts. We have to say that we have to analyze the consequences of these contracts, financial, legal consequences, or consequences that transcend the will, the effective will of the parties, which is stated in a contract where the weak part has not negotiated anything, absolutely anything. So if we buy a risk, we do it on the basis of knowing the risk, its technique, statistics, the frequency, the intensity, and these are the characteristics of risk that I have mentioned in a few books. These are going to give us an idea of the scope of the relationship. This has to be also discussed in the theology of the contract. The regularity and the legality of the provisions that Alonso Nuñez del Prado was talking about before. We have to dissect the cause of the contract and the risk, because if there is no risk, we denaturalize the contract. My question is, do contracts have a social functions now? If it is so, what's this function? How do you translate this function on the contract? Can we talk about the social relevance of the insuring activity? Can we talk about a relationship of moral order so forgotten in this materialistic society when we contemplate a policy. All risks can be assumed. What about an economic penalty, a civil risk? How do we match all this in the contracts? Should we consider public order parameters, legal parameters, according to the reigning morale in current times, or is this changing as well? So, as you all know, insurances run away from illicit guarantees. They run away from illicit services. So how legal is it for the public order to become an obstacle to insurance policies? This is a very difficult terrain to step on. So I'm sorry for asking you so many questions, but how can an illegal activity be outside the legal contract or illicit from a contract? But they establish what risks are insurable or not, and why are some excluded expressly? This is the trap of insurances. Insurances can immunize some activities, but illicit activities are not intrinsic to the contract. What happens with intentional actions? In recent legislations in Spain, in Uruguay, damages are not, or intentional actions are not insurable. So can we change this? If there is a damage, what happens with random characteristic? Otia in the 19th century said that the insurance contract was commutative, and this is related to the distribution of services. And finally, what happens with the services? Are there exceptions? We have to consider indemnification when it is higher than the real interest insured. What about the social function here? Is it understood only for the strong part of the contract or not? Are we mitigating abuse? Is there reciprocity? Is there a balance? I think many of us can say no. What happens when the risk is illegal? What happens with the interest? Is there an interest? Is there an object to the contract? Are there illicit interests or not? And if we think about a legal relationship on an insurance, what happens with the health insurances? What happens when the doctor that performs an operation, for example, is not qualified? Does the insurance policy have to cover for this? There are people that are not professionals of the health sector. So what's the role of performance? What happens with the insurance of punitive actions or economic sanctions? Can these events be insured? What happens when the interest opposes public interest? If we talk about something analysis of law, when we have an insurance contract, and John Coleman talked about this in a book, Risk and Damage, published in 2010. The parts of the contract adopt the equal conditions or complete conditions. If the contracts were complete, then we would know everything about that contract. What are the parties exposed to? Why are there gaps in the contracts? What are the costs and the transparency of an insurance? Why isn't the insurance policy more transparent? We are negotiating insurance contracts. Look for the parties to maximize their participation in the profits and minimize their contribution to the charges. Both parties have to be aware of this and of this negotiation because there are different opinions that oppose themselves. This is the key of the law of obligations, but all of this has to be based on cooperation amongst the parties, rational or reasonable cooperation amongst the parties. Cooperating, let's not forget, means to concede, arriving to a final agreement. And the limitation is not allowing the denaturalization of the contract and breaking the balance of the contract. This is something that was also mentioned by Ruben Stiglitz. The result of the cooperation is what is obtained when the contract is signed, avoiding conflict. This is very important amongst the functions of the contract. We should not forget that in this framework, there are always tensions that arise because the insurance presents conflict, because we have to decide, because we have to do transactions, we have to decide what is covered and what is not, and that is going to measure the load of the obligation charge. If the parties comply or fulfill their duties, when conflict, then cooperation wins. If conflict wins, cooperation is not possible. We should not forget this.
Another question that I would like to answer is about something that I was asking you 5 minutes ago. Are we talking about the social function of the contract? The idea is not that one of the parties wins over the other, but rather to maximize the benefit of each party.
Maximize the benefits. They exchange risk for a price, and the insurance company homogenize, standardize those prices and charges for them. 5 minutes. Thank you, Roberto. This is the balance we have to look for, but there is something else. We have to find efficiency. We have to make insurances values. We have to avoid fraud that has been researched in the Mexican doctrine. This has to stimulate and correct everything I have mentioned before, the legal deregulation, the silence of legislators, the coward absenteeism of legislators, higher costs and litigation. This happens in many experiences.
And we have to be brave enough to eradicate it, to amputate it. The exposure of risk is the main axis of a relationship. It is the need to avoiding that any of the two parties, the insurer or the policy holder, to be benefited or damaged by it in an unequal fashion. We have to avoid the palliative results. We have to avoid litigation or arbitration or any other legal remedy. This is only achieved with understandable, legible, and negotiable
conditions, with understandable and negotiable information, because Only in this way we will optimize efficient balance. Otherwise, we will be destroying the necessary balance in contracts. So what are the costs of hiring, and what are the real risks of a contract to be interpreted? Why do we have to interpret the contracts? What are the hermeneutic rules? Well, these are the rules of the normal methodology that we have learned while studying civil law. The courts have to apply transaction costs that solve these clauses. And we have to complete, we have to fill all these gaps, and we have to remove also clauses or terms, unequal terms that go against these contracts. We have to collaborate, we have to understand and maximize benefits for both parties, translating this risk, and only in this way we will minimize damage. On the other hand, in our search, we have to consider that contracts should overcome the formal and material imbalances of the foundational genetics. Stiglitz, once again, recomposing the genetics, the functional genetics of contracts, of insurance contracts, because the risk echoes on the causes. That is the risk. And in Argentina, cost talks more about interest, asymmetry in the contents, but also many other elements. If the information is imperfect or insufficient, the parties can look for other alternatives. This is one of the things we have to keep in mind, because this knows that we are trying to know what are the costs of the transaction costs, basically, because that is going to give us an idea of the covered damage. Efficiency in an economic sense only, or in a legal term? Can a contract be efficient when one of the parties ignores the mechanisms on which the contract moves? In a contract of packaged goods, what are the risks? A demographic risk? No, we're talking about a speculative risk. Is that an insurance? That is not an insurance. For an insurer, the alternative is to create new policies with coverage A or B. But for the policy holder, the alternative it reduces itself to contracting or not, of purchasing or not. The coverage A or B, well, there is no other alternative, so I adhere to that, or I do not have an insurance contract. So talking about a perfect competitive market is a fallacy. It does not consider participation. Negotiation is key amongst the contracts of functions. We should not allow the imposition of non-transparent and difficult provisions. There is no efficiency in the contract. Okay, but the insurance contracts are not easy. So we have to think about how do we want to establish the parameters of this insurance contract. We should define in a synthetic way what an insurance is, so that we can understand what its functions are. Reality is changing, it's in evolution, it transcends the frameworks of the contract, and we are seeing this with the pandemic. So we have to recover preconceptions. We have to eliminate preconceptions because we are continuously evolving. We are going through metamorphosis, like artificial intelligence, neuroscience, and many other things. So we live in a permanent transformation and adaptation to changes and the needs of policy holders. This happens with all kinds of contracts. I talked about the randomness of contracts. How do we manage randomness with big data, with artificial intelligence? These are some of the key points. We could talk about many other things, about the different functions of the insurance contracts. But I think this basically summarizes everything I wanted to say to you right now. I will finish with one word: balance. Always contractual balance. By each party. I think it's best to obtain the maximum possible profit for both parties. In this way, we will reduce damages. We know that the insurance disperses damages. It does not dilute them. Its function is not to dilute damages, but to disperse them. It is pure risk, not artificial. Something that Professor Brady talks about in his books. Transference of those risks, selecting and analyzing risk is what we have to do. Thank you very much. Thank you very much, Abel, for your excellent presentation. The chat room is open now to answer your questions. With regards to Alonso's presentation, talking about reasonableness, the principle of reasonableness, there is a Chilean professor, Professor San Martin, who has analyzed the principle of reasonableness in depth. And she analyzes the origins of the principle of reasonableness and its relationship with the economic analysis of law. That includes a behavior analysis in order to pick up the most adequate solution. And on this basis, this professor has established that we have to be careful with the danger of empty enunciations that can lead to randomness. So how do you complete, or how can we have more clarity on the principle of reasonableness, especially in the Peruvian case? On the other hand, with regards to Professor Veiga's presentation, I sustain that there are different degrees of adhesion on contracts, from the most simple to the most complex. I think that the important thing is to identify what are the protection and balance elements that we can use in order to solve all these problems that you talked about. Maybe you can specify what are the tools that you think can be used in order to solve this problem. I will quickly start. I have read the article by Professor San Martin about the principle of reasonableness. And in reality, what the application of this principle does is to give a lot of discretion to the judge, because what is reasonable and what is unreasonable, this is something that is very subjective if we try to define it in an abstract way. What is reasonable or unreasonable will depend on the case. As a consequence, the judge has to define this. Our legislations, that have a European origin, restrict the discretionality or the discretion of judges, and that it is important to award discretion to the judges if there is going to be an appeal, for example. The issue is that the judges will have to justify in detail their decisions and why they consider something as reasonable or abusive or unreasonable or contrary to justice. I think that's the only way. That, Alonso, that reasonableness would imply that judges can remove terms from the contract. Yes, indeed. It has happened in the American system. Removing terms in contract is something that our contract law also talks about. And this, our draft law incorporated a lot of these proposals that were made. So the issue, I think, is a little bit, the problem is a little bit different, I think. I think that it contradicts, because it says that many things are included because of reasonable expectations from the policy holder. The issue of freedom of contract, which is established in the Peruvian Constitution, is a principle that works for some contracts. It cannot work equally for contracts of addition because the freedom is not the same. A person that is going to go to different insurance companies, 1, 2, or 3, and they are all going to have the thing. There is not a lot of difference. Freedom of contracts cannot exceed, rather, the limits established by the state regulations. In the case of insurance law, it cannot exceed the insurance contract law. Reasonable expectations can be established with intelligent algorithms. Abel, give us your opinion. Thank you, Roberto. I think that what we have to keep in mind is the litigations arise due to inefficiencies in the negotiation, in the capacity, in the negotiating capacity of contracts. And this means that if it is, do we have to assume the cost of the insurance? The capacity of corporations are different from the capacity of individuals. So individuals have certain risks that they take or they leave, but we are entering in the complex world of contracts of addition. We have to understand the terms. They have to be legible, they have to be transparent and not ambiguous. So how can we solve this? How can we avoid all these problems through control mechanisms, the regulations, the law, the civil laws, not just the insurance law. Is visible and what is inadmissible. I remember a man that said that there is no simplicity in the draft conditions. That is one extreme. Another dimension, but there we are going to the area of interpretation. The want to start amputating the
podemos olvidar que un consumidor puede racionalmente contratar o no el seguro, puede anticiparse a las posibles consecuencias dañosas.
Or not. They make their contract and they make their reasonable or decision, and that increases their security. The problem is what stimuli, what do we have in order to have these expectations fulfilled? The expectations that I thought this was covered, I thought this was the content of the insurance contract, but all of this is denaturalized. This is the great danger that we have, the denaturalization of the insurance contract that requires palliative solutions in courts. But many times the courts tend to go the other way, and they give us a list of difficulties that we have. So what's the amount of information that consumers have to have? What happens with the consumers that do not read what they are signing? One thing is not understanding what you read. Another thing is to sign the contract without even reading it, without reading, and you don't know what your contract says. You don't know what's the magnitude of your duties and the rights that you have in this contract. Well, thank you very much, Abel. I would like to briefly say that, in my opinion, the problem that Professor Veiga is talking about, that is, these problems arise due to problems in the information or lack of information. Herbert Simon talks about the fact that vis-a-vis the overabundance of information, we have to try to solve, or we have to consider how to inform the consumers about the contents of the contract. How can we? Another question is, how does big data and AI impact on insurances? One of the biggest tools that we have now in order to solve the problems of contracts is something we have to discuss. Yes, Professor Sobrino has made this question probably. These are the new technologies that are going to change. We have to understand in real time, we can understand lots or big data on health If we have autonomous vehicles, for example, unmanned vehicles, robots, we have different ways of knowing, of having information. A robot is a corporation, is a legal person, or is it an electronic person? What's the civil responsibility they have if these are smart robots, for example? They don't make decisions on their own. All of this is changing the contracts. Contracts should be more transparent, more perfect. Well, algorithms, smart algorithms should help us on this. And the smart contracts, 20 years ago, we talked about electronic contracts, and these contracts meant downloading a PDF with the conditions. But in the end, who is going to interpret the algorithm if it's interpretable or not? So on the same line, smart contracts are going to be really smart. Are they going to know all the data, all the information? Should it be interpreted from verbal language? Do we have to translate it or not? So there is a lot of questions here that we still have to work on and discuss. You have mentioned about a big problem that consumers have. How dangerous is the excess of information as well as the lack of information? I don't know what's more dangerous in a contract. When we question the degree of contractual freedom that the parties have, is it what is more dangerous, the excess of information, the surplus of information, or the lack of information? What's the role of informative symmetry? What's the role of efficiency? A contract is efficient if it denaturalizes the causes of the contract, if the moral conduct of the policy holder is the opposite of what was stipulated at the beginning. All of this is distortioning the insurance contracts. So I think that we have a lot of space to evolve. We're at the beginning, not at the end. So I think this is going to change. This is going to adapt. We have to break many taboos, a lot of ignorance and lack of knowledge. This is going to be a fundamental role for managing claims, for speeding up intelligent or smart algorithms and everything we are hearing about parametric insurances. But I always say something, the freedom of deciding to buy or not. For the freedom to agree on the content of a contract. That's the key. One thing is to decide if I buy that contract or not. And another thing is if I can agree on the terms of that contract. Perfect. Thank you very much, Abel. Maybe a question, another question is, for example, when we define safe contracts, we talk about risk transfer. So what has changed, the contract or the event of risk? This is a question for Abel and for Alonso. And there are many other questions. There is a question for Abel Veiga that says, isn't there a symmetry between interest and premium? Well, what changes are the risks technology has made, well, some years ago we talked about the new or emerging risks. Now we have to pronounce everything in English. All the terms are in English, and I think it's fantastic. I think it's great. That's the wealth. Well, our Spanish language is much richer than the English language, but in essence, what's changing is the new risks, that adaptability to the contract. What do we have to change? The content, or the way, or the form. What happens is that, well, this is what happened at the end of the 90s with electronic contracts or telephone contracts. Has something changed since those times? The contracts are better protected, or do we have the same problems? We're just changing our clothes. We are adapting, we are digitalizing ourselves, we are modernizing ourselves, and that helps a lot. We can talk about ethics as well. The most advanced legislations did not award personal responsibility to corporations, but now they do. I think we have to measure this fairly. There are many questions that we have to answer eventually. How do we interpret a smart contract? If it's smart, it should not be interpreted. So this is what we have to think about. We have changed a few things, and you can hire a group, a collective with common needs, and they can draft their own insurance contract. Since they have no claims, they have a specific asset, but explain that to the control authorities. And regarding the question about finding a balance between interest and the premium from the point of view of the economic assessment, there are many interests when we talk about insurance contracts. There are interests on some different types of contracts. How do we value the interest of a partner in a society, the economic interest, the financial interest? So we have to look for a match, a symphony. So we have to consider the edge of risk, the dichotomy of risk versus premium. The essential part is risk. What interests are we talking about when I insure third parties? When legislations are allowing it. So I will leave now the floor to Alonso to complete the idea.
Yo creo que el tema de los grandes cambios que hay en los riesgos producto de la evolución tecnológica son evidentes por todas partes, colaboran en algunos aspectos, ponen nuevos problemas por otros, y yo creo que allí hay un gran desafío para el supervisor, que es el que de alguna manera tiene que tratar de buscar algún tipo de adecuación, que tampoco se va a dar de un día para el otro, es un proceso, y también para quienes estamos vinculados al tema legal, para quienes estamos vinculados al tema técnico, etcétera. O sea, hay un desafío múltiple que iremos resolviendo poco a poco.
Perfecto. Bueno, yo creo que ya vamos terminando. Abel, Alonso, tenemos 1 hora y media de seminario o de webinar, que sería la nueva expresión de hoy día. La verdad es que los felicito y agradezco mucho la generosidad de ustedes de compartir vuestro conocimiento con todos nosotros, con la gente que nos está acompañando hoy día. Siempre es una espectacular oportunidad para poder seguir aprendiendo, intercambiando conocimiento y visión sobre este especial contrato que es el contrato de seguro. ¿Ya? Espero que en la próxima oportunidad ya pueda ser presencial. Ese es mi gran anhelo, digamos, en el tiempo, que ya Ojalá podamos en un tiempo no muy lejano poder encontrarnos presencialmente y poder discutir de todos estos temas que son tan interesantes.
Muchas gracias.
Muchas gracias a todos, muy amables. Espero que podamos tener una grabación de estas conferencias y poderlas compartir. Gracias. Adiós.